Going over hamstring things today. Again, general theme, what is the muscle action? What is the general anatomy, origin, insertion? So hamstrings, bottom of the hip here, to here, around the knee. Might get into some considerations of the different heads of the hamstrings, but for now, hamstrings here, here, knee flexion is the main action. Also, talk about hip extension. So with the glutes, with the adductors, are going to help extend the hips. That's why we train hamstrings in an RDL. Getting into length tension relationships, so short in position, mid-range, length in position. Short position is going to be hip extended, right? So hamstrings, knee flexion plus hip extension. Fully shortened is going to be hip extension, knee flexion. What is that? Prone hamstring curl. Typically, from a hypertrophy standpoint, I'm going to put prone hamstring curl at the bottom of the list between prone hamstring, seated hamstring, RDLs. So mid-range generally, seated hamstring curl, lots of external stability. That's going to train our hamstrings through full knee flexion. It's going to be hardest where we're strongest. Also, we can train a more lengthened hamstring there, so we can get into a more fully hip flex plus full knee extension. Train lengthened knee flexion there, so we can train more mid-range, train more knee lengthened range, depending how we set it up, how we execute it. Also, more lengthened hamstring in a RDL. So fully lengthened hip flexion and the hip extension component. So generally, if I'm going to train hamstrings, I'm going to prioritize knee flexion. Also, everyone should do hinges, so we're going to do RDLs as well. Big consideration for hamstrings is going to be at the hips. So one, can we control our pelvis? If I'm doing hamstring curls and I'm just throwing my hips around like I'm Shakira, then I'm probably going to be losing tension on my hamstrings all the time, right? I want to either keep origin or insertion still. If I'm moving at the knee, I want to try and actually lock in. If I'm doing a hinge and my hips are moving around, or if I'm just in a weak position, it's going to be harder for me to get good tension through my hamstrings. So hips, stable pelvis, key number one. Another thing is going to be, from a hip extended position, can I get full knee flexion? If I'm stuck right there, cool. I probably lack the ability to fully flex my knee. Probably like ER at the hip or rotation at the hip, some component. So if we can't do a static hip extended knee flexion without our hamstrings like severely cramping, we probably need to address mobility at the hip. That's step one. Can we get into positions that we need to train them? Hamstring stuff, again, more short position, hip extension, knee flexion, prone hamstring curl. Whether prone hamstring curl lacks or doesn't win is it requires a very good sense of pelvic stability or pelvic control. So a lot of people want to hop in here and watch their hips. People want to hop in and just throw the weight around with their hips. Right, I want to walk my hips in. I want to crunch, pull these handles, get full knee flexion. If my hips do move a little bit, that's fine. So it's still a great hamstring exercise. Just to have a bit more limitations, a bit higher skill than the seated hamstring curl. So if I had to pick one, most of the time for a hamstring output, I'm gonna pick seated. Prone's still good, but more limitations. If we lack hip extension or ER, it's gonna be hard to get into full knee flexion. Also, we need to control our pelvis. So those are all considerations there. One more consideration with hamstrings in that bottom portion of the movement, our calves, also our gastroc crosses the knee joint. So we're gonna get a little bit more dominant knee flexion from them there. If we're worried about our calves contributing to the knee flexion, just make sure that we're not using momentum from the bottom to throw it up, right? They're probably gonna be losing a little bit of tension on the hamstrings. Other than that, don't worry too much about like toes point and toes flex to affect the calves. Most of the time, for any knee extension, knee flexion, just do dorsiflexion. It's gonna put us in a stronger position at the knee joint, more output. If I had to pick one hamstring exercise for a high output, I like the seated hamstring curl. High external stability, a lot of touch points, easily adjustable. I'm in this nice, strong hip flex position, more mid-range hamstrings. I want to train more lengthen, emphasize that lengthen position. I'm gonna pull my toes, get set up to push right here. The main thing I'm gonna change is I'm gonna really emphasize crunching right here. I'm not gonna overly flex the T-spine, but making sure my hips are pulled underneath me, and then I get to full knee extension right here. So if I'm training more high output mid-range, I'm not gonna be overly concerned with getting that full stretch in the top. But if I'm trying to get extra length here, train the more lengthened position, then I am gonna emphasize getting the full stretch right there. You can even set this up a little bit higher so it pulls you all the way up. But for the most part, I'm not gonna get too concerned with the granular details of that. For the most part, I wanna push hard into the pad, I'm gonna keep my chest in this neutral position right here so my ribs stacked over my hips, just so my hips are nice and stable. I don't want my hips moving around a lot, right? I want to keep tension on the hamstrings. So push, knee flexion, controlling it both ways. Right, simple, lock in, send it. This is knee flexion. I probably don't want to be super redundant in a day and have both a prone hamstring curl and a seated hamstring curl. Not saying that there's no use case for that or you can't find a way to program that, but for the most part, we're gonna be better off just picking one, getting what we can out of it. I'm trying to emphasize like pelvic position and teach it on the prone hamstring curl. Maybe I'll throw a couple sets in there and then come to a seated hamstring curl. But for the most part, I'm not gonna superset a prone hamstring curl and a seated hamstring curl. I'm not gonna probably put them in the same day. If I wanna put them in the same program, I'm probably gonna split them on different leg days throughout the week. Just understanding like knee flexion is knee flexion. The amount of nuance between like being in the more short position but some more mid to lengthen range probably is not gonna matter in the grand scheme of things, especially considering the limitations on a prone hamstring curl. Probably gonna limit output. So for the most part, pick one, send it. I probably don't want to do 3 sets of prone, 3 sets of seated. If that's the case, then I'm probably just not training very hard if I can actually do that with high output. Training RDLs from a hamstring perspective, you'll see people talk about like intentionally getting anterior pelvic tilt, so sticking my ass out so that I can get more length in my hamstrings. The thing is, as I get to this fully hip flex position, I'm probably not getting more length. I'm probably going to limit hip flexion. So at some point, I'm getting to the same length, not really adding more stimulus. If anything, I'm just putting myself in a more compromised position in a weaker position. So I'm going to get less load, probably less stimulus doing that. So I probably am generally not going to want to do this. Also, when I said executed most of the time, people's knees end up rocking back too. So it's like I'm trying to get more length, but I'm also getting less length by having my knees rock back. So I'm really reducing tension. So for hamstrings, I would rather us lock that shit in, neutral pelvis, push our hips back as far as we can. All right, now that we're over in the rear rack now, RDLs, probably one of my favorite glute and hamstring exercises. Everyone should do a heavy hinge of some sort. We can get really strong. That's gonna carry over a lot to our other glute and hamstring exercises. But again, walking through, find some cues, hip width, toes straightish, midfoot, and then RDLs can be horizontal translation of the hips. So more back to front. I don't really care about my knees bending a lot. I don't care about over bending at my waist. So once my hips stop moving back, I don't care to keep reaching. That's not gonna do anything for any of these muscles here. So I'm just thinking hips moving back to front, back to front. Again, hip width, toes straight, balls my feet, hips are back, 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 back. Another thing, head position won't matter for everybody, but a lot of people, if I have a bigger head and I'm looking up the whole time, that's actually gonna push my center of mass back. I care less about the whole neutral spine thing for most people, but my head's arched up, that's actually gonna push my weight back into my heels. So if I'm struggling to stay in my midfoot, I wanna tuck my chin, my head stays more forward, that's gonna help me stay in my midfoot better.